All right. Hi, Aymenn. Hi, Al. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. The date is February 16th. I just wanted to go over two quick things before we got our conversation started. The first is that right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the discussion is finished, I will be posting this video to our YouTube channel. Is that okay with both of you?
That's good, yeah. That's fine.
Great. And then on top of that, just the other thing to bring up is that here at Vonvo, we're all about our conversations being both civil and valuable. And so therefore, we don't want there to be any personal attacks on anyone. Are you guys fine with those ground rules?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then let's get the discussion started. Let's start with basic introductions. For anyone who watches this video, there could be people who begin to listen in. For any of our viewers, Aymenn, can you just give a quick background about yourself, and just a quick background of yourself so our viewers know who you are and how you became so passionate about this subject. And then Al, you could do the same thing.
I'm a student at Brasenose College at Oxford University. I am 20 years old, and I am doing an undergraduate degree in Classics of Oriental Studies, and I'm an Shulman Ginsburg Fellow at the Middle East Forum. And given my Middle Eastern origins, I naturally had a passion for the region, and so hence my interest in analysis and writing, and my many writings on the region, in particular Syria and Iraq. I'm Iraqi though, not Syrian.
Okay, great. And Al, how about yourself?
For some years, Max, I have been interested in issues regarding the Middle East and human rights issues, particularly in relation to the Holy Land, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And more recently, I became involved in assisting in movement in Syria involves the civil society movement that seeks reconciliation and a way forward to end violence to mediation this settlement.
Great. So, overall, and Aymenn, do you hear Al okay?
If you could speak up a bit, that would be good.
Yeah, Al, I was going to say the same thing. If you could just talk a little bit louder, that would be great, okay?
Okay.
Perfect. So, what I was going to ask is, overall, Aymenn, what exactly is your take on the current state of Syria? What is your overall take on what is kind of going on over there? And then, Al, you can respond to the same question.
Well, overall, I mean, the assessment is pretty pessimistic by any standard. I mean, there's the talk of people among the opposition in exile, saying they want to talk to the regime about finding members of the regime about finding some kind of settlement, political settlement to the civil war. But there are two things, Firstly, that even elements of the national opposition coalition in exile made it clear that they'll only talk to people who they say have had no part in the repression of the uprising. And so that's a non-starter if they say that they want to have a dialogue with the regime. And secondly, the opposition in exile doesn't really have all that much credibility actually on the ground. It's the armed groups within Syria, or the rebels as conventionally known, who will decide ultimately whether they want to push for a compromise or actually see the overthrow of the regime. I mean, there are exceptions to that. There's, for example, the head of the FSA military council in Aleppo on YouTube. He was seen tentatively endorsing the idea of a political settlement. But I mean, the reality is that it particularly won't be accepted by the jihadist oriented groups who by any standard have superior firepower to some of the more secular and moderate-minded armed rebel groups. terms of, I mean, is that? Do you think maybe that's fine to just talk about the political, whether there's a chance of political settlement? How I can respond to that? On to my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Let's just I think that's a good description and
Point, yeah.
right. And then Al, overall, I mean, unless there's anything specifically from what Aymenn just said that you wanted to respond to, what is your overall assessment of currently what is going on inside of Syria?
I think there's a general shift. I think there's a recognition across the world that they're going to have to sit down as well. I think that the world's fatigue broke the ice on this issue. Moreover, I think that the opposition, if you like, silenced in the international media, the quiet opposition, the people that met in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, their voice is now coming to the fore and being recognised. It's something that has to be taken account of. People who have, from the off, supported the process of reform and democratization of Syria, who have distanced themselves and refused violence, and likewise have refused to accept or acknowledge that there was a need for external intervention. But as I say, the national coalition, I think that the offer from Noel's fatigue was significant, that it's a breakthrough, that there is a geopolitical shift, and that geopolitical shift probably reflects decisions that have been taken in the background that we may not fully be aware of with regard to the US in terms of resolving the conflict. I thought it was interesting, and Aymenn can correct me on this, but I think that the secretary, the spokesperson at the US State Department the other day, in response to a question, said that they wouldn't be bringing the issue of Syria before the UN Security Council at the current time because the opposition was too fragmented. So I think that in itself, you can see that America is in some ways, if you like, taking down the pressure that it had ramped up previously.
Right.
So overall, as I say, I see that kind of a shift there towards mediating, negotiating settlement, but how that will play out on the ground is another one.
Go ahead,
Right.
Aymenn, go ahead.
I couldn't quite hear everything he said there until I turned up the volume, but what is he, did Al just say his bottom line is he thinks that there's a shift to getting less involved in Syria?
I think that there's a shift in recognising that there isn't a military solution, that one or other side won't achieve by force an end result, and that the parties, not just internally, but those players externally in the wider field, acknowledge that there has to be a move towards some form of mediated settlement through negotiations, a political process as opposed to a military process.
I mean, to be honest, I'm a bit skeptical of. Okay.
Go ahead, Aymenn. Go ahead.
I'm going to say that, to be honest, I'm a bit skeptical of the idea there's been a recent shift. I mean, for example, there was the news that came out that Obama rejected a plan by the CIA and Petraeus and the State Department to actually arm the rebels, and this is all the way back in the summer. So I would say certainly the Obama administration, Obama himself at least, has always been convinced in his own mind that there's no military solution to the conflict, and that ideally what he would want is a negotiated settlement. I mean, there's certainly, I think the consensus among punditry and in policy circles these days is that any kind of pushing for a military solution from outside would risk having repercussions like the Iraq War.
Al, do you have a response to that?
No, as I say, the first one I think is a viewpoint with regard to the mediated settlement through negotiations. But we're probably only looking at the very beginning, and there are probably quite a few more problems in Syria as it goes along.
Hey, Al, just quickly. I think I don't know if it's because I hear you, but there's a bit of like there's a bit of like I don't. It's a bit like foamy your voice. So if you could just either speak directly into the microphone or just speak a little bit slower, so that your words come out a little bit clearer. But I mean, we hear you. It's just a little. I don't know exactly what it is. It's a little cloudy your voice.
Unclear.
Yeah, it's a little unclear. So just speak. Yeah. No, don't do that.
And it's affecting the signal.
Yeah, that right there. What you just were doing wasn't great, but now you sound better. Say something again.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, that's good. That's better. That's great. Okay. So, Aymenn, did you want to respond to anything which Al just said, or do you want me to address another question?
Maybe address another question, I think.
All right, great. So, really, what I was kind of curious about, is Aymenn, what is your take on the recent, meetings between the Egyptian president Morsi and the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad? What do you think ultimately that a meeting like that ends up having an effect regarding Syria? What do you think ultimately they're discussing in relation to Syria?
Well, I mean, this is the thing that what worried people in think tank circles in Washington was that the visit of Ahmadinejad to Egypt constituted some kind of détente or warming of ties between Egypt and Iran. But the reality is that it's actually the White House has a better understanding that really the prospect of an Egypt-Iran rapprochement is very distant. And one of the reasons is that the Obama administration, I think, correctly thinks of the Muslim Brotherhood as a counter to Iranian influence in the region. And then one of those points of difference is Syria. I mean, there's no doubt Iran continues to prop up the regime. The Egyptian government continues to say, well, Assad must go. There's no real compromise between the two countries' positions.
Right.
So really, I don't see anything that actually I don't see any kind of moving towards a consensus between the two countries through Ahmadinejad having met Morsi in Egypt recently.
Right. And Al, did you have any specific take or stance on where that was coming from and what might be going down between those two countries based off a meeting?
Not specifically, Max, but I did note that as an aside to the large conference that was being held recently in Cairo, that the Egyptians had tried to organise a four-way meeting in which they would participate, the Iranians would participate, and also that they would have the participation of the Saudi delegate. But the Saudi delegate left before that side meeting on Syria took place. But otherwise, it's something positive. It's better that they sit down and that they are discussing the issue, as opposed to avoiding one another. From a symbolic point of view, Ahmadinejad's visit and his presence in Egypt sent a message in itself, and as Aymenn said, it probably causes some worry elsewhere, but that it's positive within the region to try and if you like, not just in terms of the Syrian issue, but in terms of an effort to put apart or incite conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims. There's something positive and symbolic in the meeting in the presence of the Iranian president, but as to what it would lead to, I don't know.
Right.
Right. Go I mean, to be honest, even the fact they met, might be symbolic in that, no Iranian leader had come to Egypt since Ahmadinejad's visit. I still don't think they still clearly don't have any kind of consensus on what to do, and their positions are actually diametrically opposed. I mean, the Saudi delegate might have walked out, but that doesn't indicate any shift towards entertaining the idea that Assad might stay in power. there's no, as I say, Egyptian government still remains committed to the idea that there's Assad must go, and in the same way, Iran continues to commit itself to supporting the regime.
Right. So what I was going to ask about is what's been getting brought up lately. And I'll ask this to Al. What's been brought up recently in some of the past Vonvos we've had regarding Syria is that pro-Assad supporters, talk about, one of the best things that Assad did for that country for a while was it was the only secular state in the region. And they kind of seem to, really be proud of that point and fall back on that in the defense of Assad. And Al, I wanted to get your, take on that whole situation behind secularism inside of Syria. And then, Aymenn, you can respond to that idea.
Okay, Max. Well, first thing, in terms of the way that you framed the question, that Assad has done something that his supporters highlight this issue. Syria and its government is more than the individual at the top. It's a collection of people. It's government ministers. It's a mechanism. It's an apparatus. It's an administration. And the country, as it had been, was secular in nature and safeguarded the religious pluralism of the community, because Syria itself is a complex mesh of various religious communities and ethnicities. So this was something positive about Syria in general. Perhaps other people who have spoken to you frame it in terms of what the president did, but I frame it in terms of Syria as a country, as a nation, as it existed, had a certain level of secularism that wasn't seen in other parts of the Middle East, and likewise safeguarded the religious pluralism within society for each group to be able to practice their religion and hold their beliefs freely and without fear, and to be able to do so in a public way. There was no restriction on an individual going to a church or a mosque, etc. So I would say that that's a very positive element, and it's one of the things that people feel that if you look at what happened in Syria in terms of a movement or a desire, a protest movement coming and who wished to see a reform process towards democratization in Syria, that the current situation as it shows itself with regard to the armed opposition in Syria doesn't reflect an attitude which seeks, if you like, to build upon the positives that already existed within the state in terms of we want to build upon the secular state, we want to build upon the religious plural nature of the state, but rather more and more we see a shift to a particular religious agenda of one specific denomination or group or affiliation. And I think that is worrying. It caused great concern to many of the minorities, and 30%, if you like, you could quantify that 30% of the people who make up the Syrian population today belong to religious minorities. Moreover, if you took it from an ethnic point of view, you'd say that 40% of the people who reside in Syria are part of one or other minority. So, just to emphasize the point that you've had people speak and you say that this is an element that they praise with regard to the president. I'd broaden that out and I'd say that it's an element that you would compliment within Syria in terms of the state, the secular, plural nature of the state, and the way that allowed the various religious factions to live beside each other in some sort of cohesive environment where there was a harmony, where there was an understanding, where there was a mutual acceptance. And that's being diminished. That's actively being diminished. And that causes great concern to many people. That's my comment on that, Max.
Right. Aymenn, go ahead and respond to anything Al just had to say.
Well, I mean, it's not entirely true that Syria was all that pluralist in terms of respecting minorities. For example, the Kurds themselves, long deprived citizenship, and the same actually with the Syrian Christian minority around Osaka in the northeast of the country. And it was no wonder that it was for that reason about denial of the Assyrian Christian identity and the upholding of an Arab Christian identity as the only acceptable one, led to the reason why the Assyrian Democratic Organization joined Syrian opposition parties. But certainly, I think Al is correct that increasingly so, there's been emergence in the opposition of Islamist armed groups who are certainly less secular, than the current regime. I mean, in particular, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and the Syrian Islamic Front. These are all groups, that do envision, a state governed according to Islamic law. So, I mean, certainly you would say that the Assad regime's claims about the opposition turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy over time. They talked about jihadists from day one, but now actually you have started to see more and more Islamists and jihadists emerging among the armed opposition in particular.
Right, and does that concern you, Aymenn? Because...
Yeah, of course it's a concern. Of course it's a concern, but I mean, I don't envision, say, after Assad comes an Islamic Republic of Syria. I think what you're looking at is a very weak government, weak central government, not only nominally ruling over many parts of Syria that will be controlled by rival warlords and militias, and many of those militias will, of course, be of a hardline Islamist orientation.
So I guess then, my question to both of you guys would be, and I guess Aymenn, just because you kind of hit on it before, is like, what would be a better scenario for Syrians to be living under? I mean, an Assad regime, or these people who are, fighting against Assad with their ideas of a, Islamic state, non-secular state? Like, what's are they like? Are Syrian people left with like the best of the worst of both worlds? Like, I'm trying to figure out what then is their move here.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just really two very, very bad alternatives. I mean, because on the other side, on the Assad side, you've actually had, cases of pro-Assad Alawite militiamen who say will beat and torture Sunni detainees and then insult Islam in the process, and that amounts to, a kind of religious persecution. I mean, that's partly, the way Alawite identity has evolved in Syria since in the modern era. Such that there was an outward policy on the Assad regime's part of portraying the religious practices of Alawites as like Orthodox Sunni Islam, but in reality, it just continued and intensified the trend towards actually being non-religious. And then the sad narrative of jihadists from day one dominating the opposition and so on leads to an outright hostility to Islam, such that Bashar al-Assad's grandfather expressed when he wanted to maintain the Alawite state and French Mandate of Syria as separate from the rest of Syria. In a memorandum he wrote with five other Alawite community leaders back then to the French Prime Minister.
Right. Al, do you have a response to some of the things that Aymenn just said, or my question before?
Yes, to the previous question and Aymenn's response there, in terms of the discussion about secularism and the nature of the state, and his reference to Kurds and Assyrians as people who hadn't fared so well under the current administration. I'd just like to point out that they don't fare any better under the opposition today. Moreover, we know that the Kurds themselves if you like, they've been drawn into the situation, then I particularly reference the events that occurred in Masalan when foreigners and others poured across the Turkish border to take that town. And that caused huge problems. Thousands fled as those fighters were coming in. More fled after the fighters arrived. And with regard to the combination, if you like, of Kurd and a Syrian Christian, it also point out that in the province of Hasaka, in the city of Hasaka, and also in Horsley, that those towns were already saturated as safe havens by refugees who were pouring in from other places. Moreover, people from Rasalan headed in that direction as well for protection. And we've seen instances where Kurd, Arab, Christian, and Muslim all came together to put out a call, please, don't come, leave us alone. If the opposition fighters enter these towns, thousands will be forced to flee again, and by virtue of their presence, they will draw in the Syrian army, and thousands more will flee. So I just like to pick up Aymenn, as I say, on that particular point that neither Kurds nor Syrians fared well under the current government, by saying that if that were the case, they certainly aren't faring any better under the armed opposition. And the armed opposition has failed to recognise their position, failed to appreciate or acknowledge that there are questions of ethnicity involved, and failed to recognise the cause that has been made constantly to leave them out of the situation. With regards to the Syrians themselves and the members that they have on the national coalition, I think it's I would also say, what have the members of the national coalition, in terms of Syrian national coalition, done in terms of exerting their influence? If they have influence, what have they done? How have they protected their people from what has befallen them right now? And it is the armed opposition that triggered those situations for them and caused those problems. So, I mean, if you identify Syrians as being a group of people in part who are with the opposition, their participation in the opposition, and moreover their participation in the Syrian National Coalition, hasn't in any way helped to protect them or to improve their situation.
Right. Aymenn, do you have a response to any of that?
Oh, well, I actually wouldn't disagree with him about armed opposition in those cases. Yeah, definitely. Been flights of Christians from Hasaka and Ras Al Ain into southeastern Turkey. I don't disagree with him at all on that. I'd say that, now I'd say many of them, I think the best option they see is protection under Kurdish militias, the PYD in particular, and its YPG militia groups. Certainly not the FSA or Jabhat al-Nusra, certainly not under those groups. So, I think you might get a situation kind of like in Iraq, where you had many Christians from central and southern Iraq. They migrated to the Kurdistan area for protection. I mean, granted there might be problems of discrimination in the Kurdistan area towards say Christians and other minorities, but I'd say certainly they regard them as the least of all evils. The Kurds in Syria.
Right. Al, did you have a response about any of that, or not really?
Well, in relation to what Aymenn has just said and his acknowledgement of that situation, I'd just like to ask, in view of the reports that he wrote for Henry Jackson's Society late last year as Christians in Syria, I just wonder, would he change the viewpoint of that report now in hindsight, or does he see something more of the situation in which religious minorities find themselves in Syria? Does he still hold the views as expressed with regard to Christians, as he stated them in that report? Or, if you are convinced, does he change that viewpoint?
Okay, I'll respond now. report, I'd like to stress that actually.
Okay, go.
Sorry.
Go. I heard a ringing for a second, but go ahead now. I think it went away.
Okay. Right. What I'd like to stress is that that report strictly was a matter of analytical and interest, for future historians, whoever might want to write about the conflict, looking at specific instances and claims of mass Christian persecution, like the claim that the Baruch Battalion ethnically cleansed 90% of the Christian population of Homs by March 2012. And I'd still say that was a false report. But I mean that I never said that. This means that the opposition is great and is not going to be. There's not going to be any more instances. There are not going to be instances of Christian persecution. I actually explicitly said that in particular, the rise of jihadist elements would pose a significant risk to Christian communities in Syria. And what I said was, I also, when I was interviewed by The Guardian about it, I made it clear that I don't want to invest too much personally in having refuted, say, a report put out by a pro-Assad propaganda site about alleged mass ethnic cleansing of Christians from Homs, because, as I said, over time, more and more of what of the Assad narrative from the beginning of the uprising would become a matter of self-fulfilling prophecy without any kind of actual. So what I'd say is I don't see how what I wrote about in that report differs from what I'm necessarily saying here. And even in that report, I mentioned specific instances from before these instances in Ras Al Ain and Hasaka that you've just spoken about, and which I agree with have happened. I spoke about specific instances, actually even those not necessarily covered widely in media, like an instance in Kastal al-Burj, where there was an armed rebel group that expelled the Christian inhabitants of that village in the Hama area in Central.
Al, did you want to respond to any of that?
I can understand. In one sense, you say that you didn't want to invest too much time personally reflecting on stuff that was propaganda. So I don't know so much.
I didn't say.
But on the other hand,
No.
You recognize that.
You've misunderstood me. I didn't say invest, time discussing it. Of course, it's worth discussing, for interests of, whoever wants to write a history of the conflict going right from March 2011 up till the present time, whatever that may be. I'm just saying that, I didn't write that report to try to reassure people about the opposition, necessarily, or the nature of the opposition.
I appreciate that. As you said when you spoke about the report, you said that that in a sense it's a piece of analytical work for historic purposes.
Yeah.
And what concerns me is that in the future people will look at this, and if they follow what you have said in this report, I mean it almost goes in the way of trying to contradict, if you like, the narrative that there was a specific form of sectarian persecution taking place. And then all through the report, somehow, it's like you try to cast doubt as opposed to do anything else other than say, well, look, some of this might happen, but the analysis that you use, where, say, and I'm sorry, it's not that I want to overly criticize your work, but in that report, there are two instances where you analyze figures that are provided. Figures for people kidnapped in Rabelais, and figures for people who are displaced from Qusayr. And on the grounds that the figures from the various sources don't match, it's almost as though you draw the conclusion that the story surrounding the sectarian persecution of individuals on a religious basis mustn't quite be so, or mustn't quite be as reported, or mustn't be really factual, because the figures given with regard to the incidents vary so much.
That wasn't just the figures.
That worries me. that you use these figures, cross-reference these articles, and that you say, well, because they can't get their figures right, it mustn't have happened, or it's not as they have said.
Not just that, of course. There was also nature of the sources reporting it, and just the discrepancies in the narrative given on it. I mean, that's, as I say, that's just one specific incident that at a particular time frame. Whereas I'd say, whereas these reports that came out from Hasaka and Ras Al Ain, they've been done by people who are more credible. And as I said, it's just it's not. As I say, it's not an attempt to be partisan for one side or the other. It was just trying to analyze sources. Did X and Y really happen? I did the same about. Did you read an article I wrote about alleged massacre about the town of Akrab, which is near Hama? And I said that there was nothing in I didn't buy the rebel story at all about that they were taken hostage, that the residents were taken hostage by pro-regime militiamen, massacred, and it was all done to cover that up. And then the regime tried to cover it up, and then only the rebels rescued them. So I mean, as I say, my interest solely is analytical, and I think if people do look at my work elsewhere, they'll see that I wasn't trying to downplay one side or the other in my writing.
I accept your genuine intent, Aymenn. I can tell you that I have met a refugee from Qusair and another from Rabelais who confirm the story, but certainly there'll be a discrepancy in the number they give you, because in the context of a conflict, when you're in the middle of a situation like that and you need to flee, and there's a conflict between two sides and people are trapped in the middle, they don't have the time to go and, if you like, take a census, ascertain how many people were kidnapped on a particular day, or what the exact Christian population of the town was at the time that people left. And whereas you rightly do point out in your report regarding Qusair that I think it's a site you quoted or referenced by Jihad Watch. Jihad Watch were wrong to say that 9,000 people were going to be expelled. 9,000 Christians left that district either as a result of sectarianism or just a general fear of being caught in a conflict between two armed sides. But I can confirm, as was told to me by the refugee from Qusair, that an expulsion order was issued on the remaining 1,000 individuals. And that expulsion order, that expulsion order was served by a man called Abdul Salim Harba. And that expulsion order was given at the end of May or the beginning of June from the mosques in Qusair, and the Christians effectively were told that the remaining Christian community were effectively told to get out.
Right. With
regard to Rabelais, the refugee from there did confirm that people were kidnapped, and the nature of that kidnapping was that it's an agricultural community with large orchards around that village. They needed to go out and save those crops as best they could in order to have some form of an income in the autumn. There was some form of a negotiation that took place locally that would allow them to defeat, to harvest their crops.
What did he say? Sorry?
There was some form of a negotiation that would allow the people of the village to go out and harvest their crops. And when they went to the orchards to harvest their crops, people were abducted. As to the exact number that were abducted, I don't know, and the refugee that told me couldn't give the exact number because they didn't count them as a group. Subsequently, after the negotiations that you mentioned, after they were released and returned to the village, there was a proviso, and the proviso was that the Christians were to vacate the village, but they didn't do that. Just as a footnote, they didn't adhere to the request that they all vacate the village. The armed opposition told them they had 10 days to get out, but they didn't adhere to that request from the armed opposition or that demand. And just one other point of clarity. when the people in Rabelais talk about armed opposition crime and incidents that happened there, you mentioned that while it's unlikely that the second event would have taken place because the army had arrived and cleared the rebels from that area, so that if the army was present, how could the rebels have come back and done this? What the refugee I spoke to confirmed to me was that the army turned up in the first instance and cleared the rebels from the region in order for the town to be relieved and receive food and medical aid. But that subsequently the army withdrew and went to another area. And after the army withdrew and went to another area, the rebels, if you like, returned to surround the village itself. There's just a point of clarity on that issue. As I say, I don't want to concentrate on it too much, but looking at that report, there were things that concerned me in the way that it was framed, and there were people referenced in that report. One mustn't be telling the truth because it didn't agree with the narrative you wanted to project, and another must be telling the truth because they did agree with your narrative. And I just contrast the way in which you deal with Mother Agnes Miriam of the Cross and the way that you deal with Father Paolo de Lalio, you know, in terms of what you referenced in that report.
Who's the other person you talk about?
Father Paolo de Lalio.
Right. But, right, but what narrative specifically did you think I was promoting?
I think the narrative was to try and, if you like, cast doubt over the idea at that time that there was a deliberate form of sectarianism taking place that targeted Christian minority.
Right, my conclusion was that there's nothing, just a complete nationwide campaign of persecution by the opposition at that point. But with regards to Rabelais, I did actually say that there could be a kernel of truth in what was being reported, in the sense that there was fighting in the area, and that there might have been some Christians who were killed in the process. I mean, actually, there was one reporter who did go to the town, and then some of the residents held some photos of those they said were killed, and certainly there's no reason to doubt them. I just found it a bit odd. There were just certain deeds. I mean, it wasn't just about discrepancies in numbers. It was also just the idea that at the time the report, the idea of a mass hostage taking, that story came out. It was just the last that we'd heard. The town was secured by the Syrian army, and they'd driven out the rebel.
Okay, well, as I say, in speaking to those two refugees, one from Qusair and one from Rabelais, I can confirm to you that the army withdrew afterwards, so the village wasn't secure, and that subsequently precipitated the situation where the mass kidnap took place. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview here this evening, that I'm involved with a group in helping to support an initiative called Musalaha, and it's a civil society initiative. See it as distinct from these are just people who do their bit. But in a sense, the Musalaha was instrumental to try and negotiate for the release of the people who had been taken in that village. So it's just that I'm more aware of that particular situation. But as I say, that's what I felt, that if it's to serve as a piece of historic analysis on the issue, I really think you should go back and perhaps talk directly to some of the people you referenced. They can be spoken to.
Okay.
Hey guys, are you there?
Okay. Yeah.
So, what I was going to ask is, someone named Lizette, who is watching and listening to your discussion, is intrigued to ask you both a question. And she says in the text box, if the events in Syria is being portrayed as a civil war / human rights concern, then why suddenly is this become a world issue? Why didn't anyone involve themselves years ago if Assad is such a dictator and evil? Does Aymenn, do you have a response to that, or yeah, Aymenn, why don't you respond to that, and then Al, you go next.
To be honest, I'm not sure what he's trying to say. I mean, she says, if the event in Syria has been created a civil war, why suddenly has it become a world issue? Well, precisely because it has become a civil war. Become a world issue. I mean, my response. I mean, it's like she's just answered her question within her question.
Okay, Al, do you see any clarity behind that question, and would you like to answer it?
Well, from the way that you explained it, Max, I take it that Lisette is saying, why now? Why this international pressure on this government to be deposed when it has existed for years, and where was the pressure previously? I think that comes down to a certain extent, that comes down to regional and international geopolitics at this time. Because if we look at what's happening in Bahrain right now, we can see that there isn't the same call from the international community with regard to the Bahraini regime, with regard to the people who are out on the streets consistently for 2 years demonstrating there. Likewise, countries such as the United Kingdom and the US tend to be quite mute in their criticism of Saudi Arabia. And we know that there are problems ongoing inside Saudi Arabia, particularly in its eastern province, where people have tried to rise up to seek change of, if you like, monarchical regimes that are much more fearsome in the way in which they impose their will on the people. And in a sense, if you were to calibrate it on a scale and you were to contrast Syria as a state with either of those, or Qatar for that instance, you would find that Saudi Arabia and Bahrain would rest a lot lower on the scale in terms of points favourable to their rule. I hope that if you know what I mean. I think there's a geopolitics at play in Syria that has dictated the situation in terms of the ramping up of the conflict, in terms of the fueling of the conflict, in terms of the arming of the conflict, and in terms of the external pressure that has been brought to bear on the state with regard to the conflict. You know, there simply hasn't been sufficient will within the international community to see a proper, mediated, negotiated political settlement to this up till now. Maybe that ground is shifting, and that's where our conversation started at the beginning of this program. But with regard to Lisette, I think it's a well-observed point. Why now? As opposed to why not before? You know, or why not some other country? But as I say, if you were to look at the region in general, there are other countries that would come out a lot lower on a scale of behaviour. But there is a certain geopolitics involved, and I think if you just even go back to the situation that I mentioned earlier in Ras Al Ain, I mean, the calamity that has befallen that town, in many ways you can rest that at the feet of the Turkish government who opened their border and allowed what happened to take place. And I mean, there are reports from citizens in Ras Al Ain that even Turkish military helicopters came over that town at night to provide cover for the cohort of people who engaged. So, I mean, by now, what's happening in Syria in terms of ramping up violence rather than ramping up peace, it's an important question that needs to be answered. Maybe Aymenn has something more that he can contribute on that, but this next question is quite relevant.
No, but you see what she was implying that only, you know, just now that it's suddenly become an interest, whereas people have been talking about this since a long time. And I actually agree with Al about the point about geopolitics, about why UK and US are mute on Bahrain. He's right about you know, in turn being mute on Saudi Arabia and its deployment of troops in Bahrain. But what I thought she was saying is, I thought she was saying, you know, why suddenly only now, you know, right at this present time, has Syria become a sudden matter of interest? I mean, not that the interest is, not international interest is unjustified, but in fact, this interest has been going on for a long time, And secondly, I agree with Al about the geopolitics thing, about why, say, there's comparatively little concern about Bahrain and the repression of protests.
So what I would then ask next is, I mean, like, what is your overall take on the amount of global influence that is finding its way into this conflict? Aymenn, what is your opinion on that subject? And can you kind of come up with a solution regarding it if you're in favor or not in favor of it?
Well, in terms of global influence, it just mostly consists of saying of various sides issuing a statement. We want, say, Egypt saying let's call Assad must go. And in terms of the actual support that goes to armed opposition groups, still mostly comes from private funding. In terms of what Saudi Arabia and Qatar have primarily done is to their satellite stations. They've helped route connectivity across the Arab world, obviously overwhelmingly against the Assad regime. In terms of and meanwhile the West actually doesn't do much at all about the situation apart from just talk here and there. It's just, so in terms the main country with active and extensive involvement at the moment in terms of trying to prop up one side is Iran, but in terms of the solution, I can't really. I don't see one coming about anytime soon. I see this as a conflict going on for years to come. And I don't see a stable government. I see chaos as the norm there for quite some time, and I share Al's concerns about say Christian exodus from the country, and not only that, but also just the general humanitarian plight of the population.
Right, Al. Could you give us your take on the overall, anything that Aymenn said, and then overall the amount of international influence that seems to be finding itself inside of Syria?
Well, I agree with Aymenn when he spoke there about the use of satellite television networks in Saudi Arabia and places like Qatar, if you like, to ramp up the sectarianism, to ramp up a particular perspective of the situation in Syria. And I think that the mainstream media in Western countries and NATO countries have tried to ignore that aspect of the conflict, while at the same time trying to, until now, maybe they've opened up more to a reality in Syria that's present on the ground, but that for some time they masked the reality that we presented this conflict in Western media as something that was black and white, good and bad. The problem was it can't framed in those terms. It's a very grey situation, and it certainly Qatar and Saudi Arabia have played a very poor part in terms of what has happened there. With regard to settlement, the settlement in Syria, in terms of the future of Syria, has to be in the hands of the Syrian people. And the international community should work to ensure that it is the Syrian people who have the opportunity to decide for themselves what their future will be. It should not be at the behest of NATO or Saudi Arabia, of Qatar, of Iran, of Russia. It has to be mediated and settled in such a way that the international community come to the realization that Syria is a sovereign state and that the people are sovereign in themselves and should be facilitated in deciding their own future. As to Aymenn's viewpoint, this is going to continue on for a very long time. I'm not sure. I'm a little bit more hopeful that with the shift in position that we've seen in the last few months, that although it may take some time to resolve, that the situation may end sooner rather than later. But that's just a viewpoint.
Right. So I don't know what sort of if you guys want to continue the conversation. We're coming up on almost an hour we've been speaking. I have some other items that we can discuss. If you'd like to bring them up, would you guys like to continue the conversation?
Oh, sure.
Okay, I have heard it quite, yeah.
All right, so overall, then I'd like to move the conversation towards the idea of solutions. Aymenn, there's a lot of rebels inside of Syria that apparently, are from other countries around the world and have no real concern for Syria, but they're there just to fight the Assad regime and have been, pushed from other countries into Syria to do so. I wanted to get your take on, how there can really be solutions with a lot of these rebel fighters not being Syrian but being from other countries, and what your take on just the whole rebel situation was.
Well, I mean, foreign elements is another thing that includes the idea of a settlement or some kind of stable government that would be acceptable, to all sides in the let's say in the aftermath if Assad does fall eventually. I mean, which I still think is, by the way, a very long way off. At least, I mean, at the very least, I expect he'll still keep hold of Damascus by the end of this year, definitely. So yeah, as I said earlier, that in the end, it's not really going to be down to or outside of Syria saying let's talk about this and that, and then hope for some kind of solution. It's going to have to be people on the ground taking the initiative. They want to have if there's a desire to have a negotiating. With regards to Al's last point about Western media, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't quite take his such negative view of the coverage. I mean, there's barely any AFP or Reuters item that comes out without mentioning a sectarian dynamic of Alawites and Sunnis, or if they do an article about Christians. I mean, it's not that they will. They're not going to. They don't say Christians have been on the side of the opposition against the brutal regime. They say actually generally Christians have sided with the regime because they fear an Islamist state as the future if Assad goes. And even in fact the most recent incident of Christian persecution that I came across came from an AFP news item regarding some Christians in Yaqubiyya apparently having their homes looted by Harakat Ahrar al-Sham al-Islamiyya.
Right. What happened to Al?
What did happen to Al?
Al just disappeared.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps his connection wasn't very strong, he said. And the fact that he got through an hour was actually surprising. I thought that maybe there would be issues. But let's see. I mean, he could log back out and then log back in. And I guess while he's just out, and let me message him on Facebook quickly. What I was going to ask you as I'm messaging him, so then what are, you're a writer on this story, Aymenn, and people know your work. I mean, the work that you do regarding solutions, what do you suggest in your writings? How do people move forward here? What is your ideal, scenario for a Syrian country? What do you suggest?
Well, I mean, the ideal scenario would be a government that could emerge. I mean, there's no use in having Assad in power. I mean, he's not going. I mean, even if you support the regime and say, oh, he's better, he's by far better than his alternative, any alternative. I mean, the reality is, though, is that you have to acknowledge that he can't control the whole country anymore. It's just simply not possible, particularly in the rural areas and around, say, Aleppo and in Idlib and many parts of Deir ez-Zor. It's as I say, simply not possible for it's simply not possible for him to assert control over the country anymore. So, for any pro-Assad people who might have a hope that he's the best hope Syria has, then it's still an unrealistic hope because, as I say, he can't assert control over the whole country. As I say, ideally there would be some government that could assert control over the country, rein in militias and so on. But it's going to be quite a momentous task, and it would be quite a momentous task. And I'm doubtful even if Syria could ever recover from this civil war and humanitarian crisis that has engulfed it.
Al, did you? Yeah, Al, do you hear us?
Yes, sorry, the power cut out here, so I didn't hear all of the client's answer to your question. But just to pick up on a couple of things in terms of control, I think when he mentions about areas of the country that are outside the control of the state, I think one of the things that we should recognise is that cities like Aleppo never wanted to be part of this uprising.
I actually agree about that point about that there was always there was that towards rebels on a number of grounds in Aleppo about them being rural, uneducated, overly religious, and so on. And that actually you find that quite a lot of even opposition activists in that city of Aleppo who say that who actually spend a lot of their time exposing rebel abuses and so on. So I agree about that point about these divisions. See that division, Aleppo and its surrounding countryside and much of the surrounding countryside. It's just one more thing that would make the task of, say, reuniting Syria ever again all the more difficult.
Right, and Al and Aymenn, just before you continue, what I was just going to say is, Aymenn, Lizette asked you a question in the text chat that, if you could address would be great. I'm going to continue the recording on my computer, but I have to run to make a call. I wanted to thank both of you for your time. And if, Al, you want to address Lizette's question as well, and you guys want to continue your discussion, because I see a new user has just jumped in on the conversation, we'd love to have you continue, and I will continue the recording for sure on my computer, and I'll upload it in another day, in a day or so. So is that okay with you guys? And
I'd have to go in about 10-15 minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll just address this question from the viewer, and we can both sign off. Yeah. Okay. To answer a question, I'm not saying I didn't prepare to say that Assad should or should not run the country. I mean, what I'm saying is that those who think he's the best option at this time, it's still an unrealistic hope, I say, because he's not able to reassert his control over the whole country. There's no, what I'd say is even if you love the status quo under Assad for a decade, and then I can hear something coming from your okay. What I was saying is that there's no going back to that stable status quo with Assad. He is able. Okay. Do you want to address that question? I mean, Al, do you think Assad can reassert his control over the whole country?
Well, it's not that I'd say that he will reassert his control over the country so much as I would say that it's the country's right to decide. That's just something to mention, is that for 2014 there is going to be a presidential election, and under the changes and reforms that have already been made, there's a time limit to presidency of 5 years and a maximum of 2 terms in office. So I don't think it's a case of a specific president reasserting their control as opposed to Syria itself being able to retain its sovereignty and people who are sovereign in decisions that they make with regard to their future. You heard that, Aymenn?
Yeah, I heard that. It's but as I say, even if let's say a new president is elected, let's say Assad does decide to step down, but it's still the same Ba'ath regime. It's still, as I say, I don't see a single state, I don't see a single entity being able to assert its control of the whole country at this time. Whether Assad gets overthrown by some opposition group, or whether he decides to step down, or whether he in 2014, or whether he decides to stay on, it's all a very fragmented mess, and I'm not sure. I don't see anything positive coming out for many years to come. Just like Lebanon was a 15-year civil war, why necessarily suppose that Syria will be more any better?
Well, by extension, if you think about it in terms of Lebanon has already gone through this heavy experience of being pulled apart and then trying to reform itself into the state again. I would hope that it wouldn't take so long, and that the benefit of hindsight, if you like, in terms of what happened in Lebanon, would inform Syria itself in terms of its future and the need to re-establish a unity, and that's one of the things that Salah on a civil society level seeks to achieve, that